Hello, and welcome to the October edition of the American Welding Society webinar series. My name is Trish Clausen, and I'm in AWS Marketing. Today's topic is AWS Standards, Cracking the Codes that Protect Our Industry. We're pleased to have Peter Portella, Director of Standards Development at AWS, as our speaker today. Now, as the webinar progresses, you may have questions. Please feel free to submit them in the chat or questions menu, and one of our staff will either answer immediately or pose the question at the end when we have a formal Q&A session. Now, without further ado, take it away, Peter.
Thanks, Trish. So my name is Peter Portella, and I'm the Director of Standards Development at the American Welding Society. Today, I just want to walk you through a few things about standards, a little bit about the history of AWS, what a standard is, how we develop our standards, and finally, if you're interested, how to get involved with AWS committees. So AWS was founded in 1919 when, driven by the need to regulate welding during the war to ensure quality products. President Woodrow Wilson asked Comfort A. Adams, a Harvard professor, to oversee what would eventually become the American Welding Society. You can see there the 1924 annual fall convention and everyone looking dapper. So everybody knows D11, but something came before D11. In 1928, the Code for Fusion Welding and Gas Cutting in Building Construction was published. This was the predecessor to D11, the big red book we all know. In addition, you can see the Welding Handbook on the right, the 1938 edition. So standards, what do they really do? Ultimately, AWS has a goal of making the world a safer place, and we do that in part through our standards. So everybody that's involved with the standards, from the welder that's using it to the committee member that's helping write it, is involved in AWS's mission. So first we have a question. Everybody knows D1.1, but approximately how many standards does AWS maintain? Okay, let's see what the answer looks like. Oh, most of you were right. So we have approximately 300 standards currently, though that number does increase all the time. This quarter, actually, we printed 22 standards, which is a record high for us. So our standards department has 13 individuals that manage those approximately 300 standards. What started with just D1.1 has grown into, like we said, hundreds of standards in all different parts of the industry. Ultimately, we always evaluate opportunities for creating new standards, and it all starts with volunteers. When somebody has an idea for a standard or a committee, they can come to AWS and say, you know what, this is an area where AWS should really get involved. We really need some sort of rules or regulations, things such as bridges, robotics, railroads, brazing and soldering, and most recently additive manufacturing, all started with volunteers coming to AWS and saying, you know what, let's start this committee up. The word standard, you may hear it all the time, but what does it really mean? So a standard can be a code where the regulation is actually referenced in US law, or it can be a specification where it gives detailed information on processes, or it can be a guide or a recommended practice. Those are a little less stringent than codes or specifications, but oftentimes share even more detailed background information and almost educational material. Our standards are broken down by category, depending on their focus. So this is what determines the color of the cover you see. So D1.1 is the big red book, but really it's red because it's part of the industrial applications category, where A3.0, our terms and definitions, is the brown book, and that's because it's part of fundamentals. A few fundamentals that you may have seen before are also A2.4, which has our symbols, and all of our A5 documents, which are the specifications for filler metals. The B documents are the qualification and inspection documents. So B2.1, for example, the welding procedure and performance qualification, or B4.0, the standard methods for mechanical testing. Now, if you go into processes, the C documents, you see standards such as C3.14 for braze joints or C7.6 for hybrid welding. Moving into the D documents, you obviously have the whole suite of D1 documents, as well as underwater welding, sheet metal, railroad, aerospace, and quite a few others. Moving into safety and health, you have F2.3 for performance of transparent welding, and also F4.2 for properly selecting welding cables. Moving into the G documents, which are materials, and finally finishing off with the J documents that are welding equipment. So right now, all of our documents fit within these, but that's not to say that one day we may have to expand based on industry. So our standards are really, so they're ANSI accredited. What does that mean? ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, and they're the governing body that accredits standards organization. That's a lot of words, but what it comes down to is they look at our process and make sure that we are doing things in an honest and open way. They want to make sure that no matter who you are, if you're devoting your time to these AWS standards and you're submitting comments, you're submitting feedback, that the committee is looking at that they're really evaluating that feedback that you're providing, whether you're a member or not, and it's all through an open process. Part of this is also our meetings. So a lot of people I speak to for the first time have the misconception that our standards meetings are closed and they need a special invitation to participate. That's not the case at all. So all of our standards meetings are completely open and anybody can come join as a guest. So moving into D1.1, which we talked about a little bit, starting in 1928, it was revised and redesignated as D1.0 in 1941. Eventually, it was combined with D2.0, which was for welding highway and railway bridges, and then it was designated as D1.1. And then finally, in 2010, a major shift occurred. So we moved our publication cycle to a 5-year cycle. So that means that starting in 2010, and then 2015, 2020, etc., the document is released every 5 years. Now, that was partially to sync with the AISC steel building specifications and also the International Building Code publications. But something else that's not mentioned in the slide is, think about it, if you're revising a 600-page document every year or two, it's going to be really difficult to have any deep substantive changes. You're almost always in typesetting or near the end of the publication cycle if you're working every single year. So this gives the committees more time to really dive into deeper subjects, move into growing bits of industry and expand the document in ways that may take several years to do. Z49.1, which we mentioned briefly when we were talking about safety, is our safety standard that published in 1943. It was originally the American War Standard, Z49.1, and it had a few revisions in 1958, 67, and 73. In 83, there was a major shift like the one that we were talking about, and it was completely overhauled to incorporate changes in welding technology and clarify inconsistencies and really make it modern with technology. And then finally, in 2012, the AWS Board of Directors made a big decision based on AWS's mission. They decided that, you know what, Z49.1 really needs to be out there for everybody to use. And it shouldn't just be if you pay for it, it should be available to everyone. So as of 2012, Z49.1 and all of its revisions are free to everybody. In fact, you can go right now to the AWS website and download it. So talking about standards, I want to give a little bit of insight as to how our standards are created. Everybody's used to seeing them either in their PDF form or in their printed form, but how does a standard begin? So like we talked about, if volunteers have an idea for a standard, whether they are currently on a committee or they're not involved with AWS at all, they'll come to AWS and tell us, hey, we really think that you should create a standard. The most recent version of this was D20.1 for additive manufacturing. We had a group of volunteers. They came to AWS. They said, I have a handful of people that really want to get involved, and we think we can create a good standard for AWS for additive manufacturing. From there, a committee was created. And it took a few years, a lot of meetings, a lot of ballots, but the document was ultimately published. Now, after the document is published for the first time, according to ANSI, you're on a 10-year cycle. And you can see there in the first square. What that means is every 10 years, you either have to revise the standard to make some changes, you have to reaffirm it to let ANSI and everyone know, hey, this document is actually in really great shape. It doesn't need any technical changes. Give us another 10 years. Or you withdraw it if there's something fundamentally wrong with the document. Now, the way this happens is through our ballots. Our ballots are just either small chunks or large chunks or even whole documents that are sent to the committee for revisions. Let's say you want to throw in a new definition or maybe a new table. You can propose that to that committee. It'll get balloted. The committee members will look at it. They'll be able to provide comments, and those comments will be compiled in our AWS Spec Builder, which is our new balloting software, for the committee to review. And at the end of the cycle, you'll have a document. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but you can see in this circle here that the ballot may not happen once, it may not happen twice, it may not happen 20 times, but eventually you'll get a published document. Or on the other side of it, like we mentioned, if there's a fundamental reason to withdraw it, you could do that. But roughly 99% of our documents will end up with that green arrow and they will publish. So let's talk a little bit about our committees. So we have over 1,800 volunteers spread across 200 committees, subcommittees, and task groups. This is all managed by AWS staff, but really all these committees are the lifeblood of AWS. Not just on the standard side, but there's a lot of crossover. So somebody that may be involved in standards could also be involved on education side, or maybe in the Q&C committees for certification. The more places people are involved in within AWS, the broader their knowledge. And it really helps not just shape the standards, but it helps shape AWS as a whole. These committees vary a lot in size. So you may have some very small committees of 5 to 6 individuals. On the other side, you may have some huge committees of 50 voting members. So what really determines that? Honestly, a lot of it is how many people want to get involved, because it is a time commitment. Some industries, maybe D9, for example, they have one document. They have a very well-performing committee, but it's fairly small. I believe they have 8 or 9 voting members. They meet twice a year and they get those revisions through, no problem. Now, some of the larger documents like D1, you can imagine the voting members constitute 30 or 40 with subcommittees under that and task groups even under that. So no matter how you want to get involved in AWS, there's a place for you, absolutely. So sitting above all of our technical committees is something called the Technical Activities Committee, or TAC. TAC is kind of the top of the umbrella, and they monitor how our committees are working. So TAC is comprised of all the chairs of all the relevant technical committees. So they sit on TAC as well as a few at-large members, which may not necessarily be an officer, but they have a good amount of knowledge on standards or AWS as a whole. Now, TAC really helps drive the direction for our standards. They don't necessarily get involved in the nitty-gritty for each committee. Hey, that rhymed. But they actually do help steer the direction that AWS is taking. So an example of this is, as a whole, many of our standards are moving toward referencing B2.1 instead of just copying the information within B2.1 and putting it in their standards. What's the benefit of this? Well, if you can imagine, if you've ever worked with a handful of Word documents that are being distributed around, if you create the base information, but then instead of just telling people to look at the first document, you copy it to yours, what happens when you make changes to the first document? They don't just trickle down. So we're trying to remove those kinds of roadblocks. That way, A good example is A3.0. It used to be that most documents had a ton of definitions in them, but now each document references A3.0 for its terms and definitions, and the only definitions you'll see within each document are ones that are maybe a little more industry specific that A3.0 doesn't cover. Something else that TAC does is they write the rules of operations. So these are the rules that govern how we create our standards, how our committees run, and they're actually the rule that ANSI holds us to. Finally, TAC, though this year they've met more than twice, typically they meet twice a year. Once is in January/February at AWS headquarters in Miami, and the second time is a remote meeting, so in the August-September timeframe. This year, though, because of the pandemic and a few other topics that TAC has been involved in, I believe they've met 5 times. So when we're talking about committee work and ways to get involved, I did say that there's a place for everybody and there's a way to get involved no matter what activity level you're looking at. So on the screen, you can see applicant, member, advisor, corresponding member, or task group. Whether you want to get involved with a very short time commitment or a long time commitment, you have a lot of time to devote to these committees, or you're very passionate about a certain project, the first step is really to become an applicant. What that does is it puts your foot in the door, you officially join the AWS committees on the back end, and you're part of the system. Right from there, we can get you involved in task groups. You get all the meeting invitations. You get access to Spec Builder so you can see the discussions happening within each committee, and you can kind of start getting the feel of what's going on in each committee. Now, there will come a time where you've participated quite a bit, and you're thinking, well, maybe I should become a voting member. So you ask the chair of the committee, or the committee secretary asks you if you're interested, and there'll be a vote. So if you are interested, you'll become a voting member once approved by TAC. If maybe the time commitment's a little too much, but you still want to be involved in the committee, an advisor is a great way to do that. An advisor doesn't have to be present at every committee meeting like a member does, nor do they have to vote on every single proposal. And they're not part of quorum, so the pass-fail criteria doesn't really apply to an advisor. However, they can constantly provide feedback. This is especially valuable if you're somebody that maybe has 30, 40, 50 years of experience in the industry, but maybe you don't have time to be a voting member of the committee, but you still want to help shape the document. Then we move on to corresponding member. So that's an interesting place because corresponding members are usually reserved for individuals that sit on other committees, but it's a way of relaying information. For example, on TAC, the chair of the Q&C committee sits on TAC as a corresponding member. Why would that be valuable? Well, it's great for Q&C to know what TAC is doing, and it's great for TAC to know what Q&C is doing. That exchange of information and breaking down silos is really important for how AWS works. And we're constantly trying to do that, constantly trying to break down those silos and really streamline our process, not just in standards, but across the organization. Finally, task group work, I would argue, is some of the most challenging, but the most rewarding work out there. Our task groups can be anything from 5 individuals to 40 individuals. The D1 committee has task groups that deal with each of the main clauses, like fabrication, qualification. Those individuals spend a lot of time working on major changes, rewrites, or additions to those areas. So just to show you from beginning to end, you submit your application, the application's confirmed, you're added to the roster, you're notified of the upcoming meetings, you get your information to log into Spec Builder, and finally, you have the ability to review technical resources, policies, procedures, etc. So, responsibilities. We talked about this a little bit. First is volunteer. AWS really relies on its volunteers for our documents, for our work, for really everything we do. We appreciate you, even you that maybe you're not involved in AWS committee work now, but hey, you're on this webinar. So obviously you're interested in some way. We appreciate that. Contribute. There's a lot of individuals that maybe aren't used to working with AWS, but every once in a while they'll maybe send an article from another organization that's useful, or hey, this is what we're working on in this company. We thought AWS might like to know. That's great. That always helps us collaborate. So a big part of committee work is collaboration. No document is written by one individual at home and they kind of just sign it and that's it, it's over. It doesn't really work that way. I mean, it'd make the documents come out a lot faster, but maybe they wouldn't be as great. Collaboration is the key to everything we do at AWS, between committees, between members, volunteers, staff. And finally, vote. We're not just talking about the election. We're saying vote on the ballots that come out, vote on the proposals that are shown, and really get your voice active in committees. As a committee representative, your company, you're really representing your company's interests, right? If you're part of company A and you know that, qualification really matters to you, pay extra attention to those qualification changes. Make sure you're giving your input. And finally, if you have any questions at all about committee work, about standards, about anything, please reach out to me. My email's on the screen. So, one more bit of trivia. Why should you participate in AWS committee work? Okay, let's see what people said. I'm so proud of you all. Yes, all of the above. All of these things are things you will pick up during the committee, or during committee work, I'm sorry. Just to wrap it up a little bit, like we talked about, approximately 2,000 volunteer members, advisors, corresponding members, and applicants. They all represent vast places in the industry, from end users to manufacturers. They represent government or associations, suppliers, trade groups, academia, and consultants. It could be a representative from a single company of one, or you could be representing a big global behemoth. Your opinion is very valuable, and your time and effort is very valuable. And you're the reason that AWS continues to exist after 100 years and why our standards are still used constantly throughout the United States and the world. So thank you. If you're interested in looking at our offerings, you can always go to the AWS bookstore. So you can go to aws.org and click on the bookstore link and it'll take you right there. And finally, we have quite a bit of time, so I just wanted to open it up for Q&A. Any questions you may have about AWS or standards, I want to be here to answer any questions.
Okay, Peter, we have one question from Andrew. He says every 5 years we have to review, and then is there something that needs to be done by the 10th year?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So really, we're ideally on a 5-year revision cycle, though some of our documents are strictly on a 5-year. For example, D11, D15 strictly on a 5-year cycle. But ANSI is really judging us on the 10 years, right? So they're looking that within those 10 years, something was done. You either revise the document, so that just happened with a 2.4. It was a 2012 document, and we just published a new revision in 2020. What does that mean? We've satisfied that criteria. Now ANSI's looking at the next 10 years. So we need something done by 2030. We are striving to make sure that all of our documents are being revised in a timely manner. We really don't ever want to hit that 10-year because after 10 years, what happens is you get administratively withdrawn. So ANSI says, hey, it's been 10 years since any work has been done on this document. It's administratively withdrawn. It's not banned or anything. You can still buy the document, but it is now no longer the ANSI, the American National Standard for that industry. So it's really important that for AWS to retain ownership of certain key standards, we make sure we're revising in a timely manner.
Thanks, Peter. How about ISO, the International Standards Organization? How do we work with them similarly, or would you talk about that a little?
Sure. So yes, we work with ISO, and Andrew Davis handles a lot of our ISO work as well as our program managers. So we participate in different ISO tags where ultimately we can submit a US position on a certain issue. International is something where we're trying to expand across the board. So while we do work with ISO and some of our standards are adopted in other countries, so for example, Costa Rica has adopted some of our standards as part of their national standards body. International is somewhere where we can always continue to grow.
Okay. We have another question saying, if I want to get involved with working with the D1 committee, how would I do that?
So that's a great question. D1 is a committee that many people are interested in working with, but really there's no true barrier to entry. If you're interested in getting involved, you can send me an email or the program manager, Jennifer Mullen, and the first step will be to have you apply to the committee. So once your information is there as an applicant to a task group or a subcommittee, you'll start receiving information for upcoming meetings. Typically, you'll be asked when you apply which committees you're interested in working with. We caution people to not apply to a ton of different committees, right? We have received some applications that have almost every committee checked, and considering the time commitment, I would say it's impossible to really be involved heavily in that many committees. So for example, on the application, you may say, oh, I want to be part of D1, and I really want to work on the fabrication task group. So you'll become an applicant on that task group and your information will be sent over, and you can start working pretty quickly, actually, especially through Spec Builder.
Okay. Shane asks, how does AWS work with API and ASME? Is there a formal process?
So that's a great question. I can answer some of it, and some of it I'll honestly have to look a little bit deeper because, for example, the boiler pressure code comes out every 2 years. Now, ASME adopts some of our A5 filler metal standards for the boiler pressure vessel code. So that's a way that we work together. Also, the chair of TAC right now is actually somebody that's been heavily involved with ASME work, Walt Spurko. So as we move forward, we're constantly trying to find better ways to work within the organizations. Our committees have individuals that oftentimes represent other SDOs or have worked heavily with other SDOs through their work. You know, like I said, we have a lot of individuals that have worked heavily with ASME, ASTM, API. In terms of formal work, there's always places that we can expand on. And if you have some ideas for ways to get involved between SDOs and committees, please reach out.
Seems like a lot of these people want to know more about how standards work internationally. Kirk has asked, in a nutshell, how does one submit proposed changes to a standard?
Okay, great. So I'm going to assume that Kirk is not part of a committee currently. So there's a few things that happen when a standard is going to be published. One, it goes through a public review cycle. When it's in public review, anybody can ask AWS for access to a standard, and they're able to submit comments. Another way is they can apply to be on a certain committee where they may be interested in that topic, and from there they can really help craft the language. If you're talking about a standard that's already been published and maybe you have some feedback on it, the easiest way would be to go on the AWS website, and you can look up the standards committees, and you can send that feedback either through me or directly to the program manager or secretary that's assigned to that committee. So if you have D1, you'll go on the AWS website, you'll go to standards, committees, and you'll look up, oh, look, it's Jennifer Mullen. And then from there, you can click her name and send her an email with any of your proposed changes or feedback based on your usage of the document out in the world.
Okay, here's a hardball one for you. Could you please explain AWS influence in welding standardization overseas? Is there a plan to achieve global standardization relating to welding norms?
So that's a great question. And honestly, we have a global strategy where we are trying to expand the usage of AWS standards internationally, as well as get more international representation on our standards committees. Ultimately, as you can imagine, we are limited somewhat because some people are not able to travel as often, or if a committee meeting is happening, let's say in Ohio, it may be challenging for somebody overseas to participate in that committee. So one of our goals and standards is to ensure that all of our committee meetings from 2021 on have remote access, right? The time zone is always going to be a little bit of a challenge because if we're having an all-day in-person meeting, it's really difficult to shift that around to make sure all time zones are covered. But we do our best not to schedule a teleconference, that maybe a 2-hour teleconference starting at 8 a.m. Eastern. We want to make sure we're catering not just the West Coast, but also in Europe, Asia, and the Aussies down below. We do have a lot of strategy we're talking about internally to try to grow AWS, but a lot of that comes from, I think, having better access to volunteers that use the standards regionally. We've discussed that, certain areas may not be using the standard the same exact way that other areas are. And the better we understand that, the better we can respond to it. I think by having better remote access and also communicating with other countries to see how they're using our standards, it'll make a big impact. South America, we've been communicating with a few countries, some of which have adopted our standards already as part of their national standards. Others are in discussions, and if you have an idea as to a place or a country or a region that AWS should expand to or really start discussions with, we'd appreciate that.
And we had a question regarding the D1 code clinic, and I have lost it. Do you know if there is a course on D11, or should we can happily answer afterwards? We can answer by email. Is there a code clinic, and does standards get involved in that?
So there is a code clinic that's handled through education. If somebody is interested in that, please feel free to send an email and we can get you in touch with the right individual. But yes, absolutely. So the code clinic is really for anybody that wants to learn how to navigate D11 and also for anybody seeking to prepare for Part C of the Certified Welding Inspector exam or an endorsement. So whether you're a welder or welding engineer, inspector, supervisor, it really caters to you. And aside from that, I can give you more information offline as well.
Okay, it looks like that is all the questions that we have right now. So with that, I will say thank you, Peter, so much for your insights. It was an incredibly information-packed presentation. We've got a couple too asking if the presentation content is going to be made available after this. And yes, you will. All attendees will be receiving a post-webinar survey, which will provide information on where you can access for future reference. Again, Peter, many thanks for helping us to understand the importance and inner workings of AWS standards. It's a department that is integral to AWS and is probably one of the ones that doesn't get as much public love as it really should. So from a marketing perspective, I'm so happy that we were able to do this with you. Again, thank you all for joining us for this edition of the American Welding Society webinar series. And we'll be having another one soon, and we'll let you know.
Thank you, everyone.